On day 17, we'll be looking around this part of Washington, D.C. We'll look at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History and the African American Museum of Culture and History. First, we'll be looking at the Museum of American History. About a third of the museum is currently under renovation, so we won't be able to look at that. It has 3 floors, and we're going to start on the 2nd floor. So that is where the Star-Spangled Banner is, and then we'll move to see the First Ladies. Both of these are fairly busy exhibits, and then we'll just work our way down the rest of the museum, eating in the lower section. As we enter on the 1st floor in the lobby, they have many exhibits. Phyllis Diller's costume and Miss Piggy. Night vision goggles. First dentist chairs. Fragment of the Plymouth Rock. Early bicycle. And pedal sewing machine. Now we go to look at the Star-Spangled Banner. This is the flag that actually flew over Fort McHenry that morning when Francis Scott Key wrote our national anthem. Next, we'll head to the display for the First Ladies. We'll see dresses that they actually wore and the china that they picked out for the White House. And this is what George Washington ate off of at the White House. And now we'll go look at the presidents and things that have to do with them. First up is things that came from the various campaigns. Here we can see pins that were used by campaigns, and women used this wagon to push for suffrage. And here are various things that presidents have used when they were president. This is the chair Washington sat at in Mount Vernon. The Philadelphia was a gunboat built during the Revolutionary War by Benedict Arnold to protect Lake Champlain. It was basically a rowboat with 3 cannons on it. During the Battle of Valcour Island, it was sunk and then found again in 1935, raised and restored. We have always known that the price of freedom was war in many cases, and so we have a display at the Smithsonian that goes through the various wars, the French and Indian War, and then we move to the Revolutionary War. The last battle was at Yorktown, which we visited earlier, and this is a letter that Cornwallis wrote to concede defeat. King George thought that he would never retire and go to private life, but here he is resigning his commission. Many issues still had to be decided about freedom. What about women, Indians, African Americans? And then we had the Mexican-American War. Next came many Indian wars and the removal of the Indians from the East. Then our Civil War came. This is the desk used by Grant and Lee at Appomattox Courthouse during the surrender. One of the strategies of the North was to blockade the South's ports, so they built an ironclad called the Merrimac. In response, the Monitor was built by the North. The Monitor is in the foreground. Next we come to World War I and the Great White Fleet. World War II soon followed. During World War II, the women went to work helping to construct while the men were away fighting. Finally, the end came, and change started to happen at home on a rapid pace. Next came the Korean War, with forces pushing up and down the Korean peninsula. Then we were in Vietnam. After looking how war shaped our nation, we look at other things that shaped our nation. Muhammad Ali's gloves, Archie and Edith Bunker's chairs and hats, Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street, Crash Test Dummies, Howdy Doody, gas rationing lines, Mr. Peanut, Barbie, and other icons of advertising, Monopoly games, a gold ingot from the gold rush, incandescent lamps from Edison, the telephone, and a video recorder from 9/11. Ice skates from the Olympics and integrated circuits. Ruby slippers from Wizard of Oz. And now we move to a house. In this one house lived 5 families over a 200-year period of time. And by looking at those families and how they lived, we can find out much about that history from ordinary Americans. Next, we see the first monument to George Washington. The people almost treated him like a god at that time. This is the first steam engine in the United States, the John Bull, 1831. It was imported from England. Next, we'll be looking at the history of our food and how it has changed. This is Julia Child's kitchen. She taught us how to cook. Our food today comes from all over the world: Mexico, North Africa, Middle East, Caribbean, Thailand, Korea, China, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, and many other places. This exhibit we come to is transportation. It has a lot to do with food also, because the first transportation was used to get food to the consumers as fast as possible to stay fresh. This engine was built in 1876. Soon larger engines were being produced, up to thousands of horsepower. Passenger trains soon came with dining cars, places to sit, and mail cars. Once we got it to the end of the rail line, we had to distribute it around our cities and distribute our people too. So wagons were pulled by horses to distribute it there. In 1900, 3 million horses were being used for this purpose. We also have to carry products across the seas, and so engines were put in ships to go faster when the wind wasn't blowing. We had paddle wheelers, harbor tugboats, stern wheelers going up the rivers, and dredges to keep the rivers deep, and various other modern types of ships today, including cruise ships and tankers, container ships, and various other things. But the ultimate transportation for Americans was the car, and Route 66 was the ultimate trip. This is the first car to cross the United States from San Francisco to New York. Picked up a dog in Idaho. Soon gas stations were springing up everywhere to fill the need for running these vehicles. Pickup trucks came along, and so did motorcycles, and also 18-wheelers. We built electric cars in 1997, and we built the Tucker in '51. A spectacular failure. It was revolutionary, but only 51 were made. Next, we moved to an exhibit about electrifying America. Here we'll see exhibits of all different kinds of equipment that was made to get electricity around our nation. Generators and electrical lines, fans that were used to use that electricity, light bulbs, and many other different things as we look around this exhibit. Here we can see many of the early generators, what they look like. Here we can see various items Edison invented after leaving the telegraph office in 1869, and things that were used to use the electricity in various homes. Here's the model of a 2-story tall generator and water wheels that were used for generators. Now let's look at our innovation. These are the actual models turned into the patent office of steamboats, incandescent lamps, an Apple computer, a digital camera. And this is where the inventor Ralph Baer worked in his office to invent what was the first gaming system for TVs. His brown box was the precursor for Nintendo and Xbox, Singer's sewing machine, Underwood's typewriter, and Burroughs' adding machine. The next exhibit is about where innovation is happening right now. There's a lab where kids can go and experiment and play with various things to see what they can invent. Silicon Valley, the Bronx, Medical Alley, Hartford, Hollywood, Fort Collins, all around the United States. Now let's look at some objects that changed the world. The Macintosh computer, the Apple computer, going mobile, And now let's look at the dollhouse that was given to the Smithsonian. In the Dibner Library, we see books that influenced history. Jules Verne's 5 Weeks in a Balloon, David Livingstone's Missionary Travels and Researches, Langley's Airdrome, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and The Clipper in the Clouds, H.G. Wells' War in the Air. And our last exhibit is about money, that thing that influences us all. We'll see stone money, and bitcoins and credit cards, and other coins that have been influential in the Americas. We see money from the Confederacy and coins that were some of the earliest coins ever minted in the world. Our money is the story of our nation to some extent. It's why we moved in various ways in various places, looking for ways to get more. It may surprise you to know that many different groups made their own money in the past in the United States, such as these coins from the gold rush. After the Civil War, it became the exclusive property of the U.S. government to make money. They made the greenbacks. The color was unique to try and foil those who would counterfeit. And the $5 bill has changed over time, so our money never stays the same. So now time to move across the street to the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Its construction began in 2012, and it is now complete. And its grand opening was on September 24th, 2016. George Bush and President Obama spoke at the opening. Notice our ticket is 3 days after the opening, so we got in very early. It is clad with a metal skin that is supposed to look like an African design. There are 7 levels to this museum, most of which are underground. You take an elevator from the first floor down and then walk up the ramps through the history of the African Americans in North America. Since it's just a few days after its opening, it is extremely crowded inside, and it's hard to take pictures of the display. So we're just going to look around at most of it. This is Harriet Tubman's cabin. Slaves were originally brought to the United States for the sugar industry to help grow sugar cane. They called it the Middle Passage, and the slave ships were packed tight with people, many of which died on the way. This shows where they came from and where they went to, and this is some leg irons from original slave ship. After the Civil War, Mound Bayou was formed as a former slave community, and they thrived there in their own place. But soon, Jim Crow laws came in, and discrimination came. And so freedom riders had to come to help out. The Tuskegee Airmen were some of the most decorated in World War II. Many groups and individuals have had a hand in changing the lot of the African Americans in America. And now let's look at some of the items from famous African American people in the music industry. And there are many up-and-coming artists now also. Lastly, we come to a riot of white people that killed hundreds of African Americans in Greenwood, Oklahoma, and destroyed their community. And this brings us to the end of day 17.